Profound changes took place after World War II. After more than 100 years of European colonialism, many new countries gained their national independence. And with this independence came an era of instability and turmoil. With the end of World War II, the United States inherited not only the prestige and power, but the anger and resentment formerly reserved for the colonial powers. But the United States committed itself to protect not only the boundaries of its own shores, but to maintain the free institutions of the Western world, a task which became more and more difficult because of the innate antagonism between capitalism and communism. Kennan's theory of long-term firm containment of Russian expansionistic tendencies in Europe was to prove more difficult to apply in the area of Asia. However, hunger rather than free institutions seemed to overshadow the needs of the underdeveloped nations of the world. Home to over one-third of the world's population, the human misery and poverty that existed in Asia, especially China, were complex. 4,000 years of tradition and civilization could not stem the tide of China's decline. Throughout their history, and especially after Confucius, moral behavior was held in high esteem in China. In fact, the Confucian code of conduct dominated the Chinese way of life for nearly 2,400 years. U.S. concern with China and Asia dates back to the middle of the 19th century, when American trade with China expanded because of the development of the fast clipper ships. In the 1840s, China fell prey to European powers, the British in particular. The Anglo-Chinese War, or Opium War as it was called, made deep inroads on Chinese sovereignty. After the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, the Western powers, including Japan and France, Russia, Great Britain, Germany, and Portugal, attempted to divide the mainland of China into spheres of influence, with each taking a slice. However, the U.S. proposal of 1901, called the Open Door Policy, acted as a guarantee to the territorial integrity of China. While the powers did not actually dismember China, her fate remained in question. The Manchu dynasty, confronted with aggressive 19th century nations, was unable to stop the disintegration of her sovereignty, and the smoldering discontent with the Manchu dynasty flared into the revolution of 1911. The Chinese leader of the revolution, Sun Yat-sen, established a republic and attempted to identify it with three goals: nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. As provisional president of the new republic, Sun Yat-sen was not able to consolidate China into a viable political unit. Instead, a struggle for power began. After Sun's death in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek emerged as his successor. As the leader of the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, he too failed to accomplish the unification and modernization of China. In 1923, a handful of communists met in Canton, China. A Russian, Michael Borodin, was on hand to launch the new Chinese Communist Party. Eventually, Chinese communists were admitted into the Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang Party. By 1927, however, Chiang Kai-shek drove the communists from the Kuomintang Party and attempted to defeat them by various strategies. In 1934, surrounded by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist armies, the communists broke out and started the retreat, which became known as the Long March. Reaching the northwest, they set up headquarters in the caves of Yan'an. The march brought about important changes. Primarily, Mao Tse-Tung emerged as undisputed leader. Mao believed in the historic mission of the peasant masses. He recruited discontented peasants and consolidated his hold on the countryside. During World War II, the Kuomintang and the Communists attempted a united front against the Japanese, but in reality, these two groups did not trust each other. An uneasy truce prevailed. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, a renewal of the Civil War seemed inevitable between the Communists and the Nationalists. Sensing the urgency of the situation, President Harry S. Truman sent General George C. Marshall to China to mediate the threatened conflict. Marshall attempted to set up a coalition government. However, he was unable to accomplish his mission. In the renewed civil war that followed, Chiang's modern, well-equipped army fought Mao's peasant army until communist victory. Chiang fled with his army to the island of Taiwan, where he began to rule. In October 1949, the Communists proclaimed the People's Democratic Republic of China. Thus began the era of two Chinas, Chiang's nationalist China on Taiwan versus Mao's communist China on the mainland. The United States reacted by 1, refusing to recognize the communist government, 2, blocking Red China's admission to the United Nations, 3, and also imposing a trade embargo. These events caused a rift in American politics. Democrats blamed the fall of mainland China on the incompetence and corruption in Chiang's government. Republicans charged that American policymakers, at that time largely Democratic, with cutting back aid to Chiang Kai-shek when he needed it most. Secretary of State Dean Acheson defended the administration's policy. The ominous result of the Chinese Civil War, he said, was beyond American control. Nothing that this country did or could have done within the reasonable limits of its capabilities could have changed that result. Nothing that was left undone by this country has contributed to it. It was the product of internal Chinese forces, forces which this country tried to influence but could not. Republican Senator Joseph A. McCarthy of Wisconsin charged that there were pro-communist elements in the State Department which looked to Mao Tse-Tung as the new leader of China. While the Truman administration was still defending its China policy, the Communist People's Republic in North Korea invaded the Republic of South Korea's territory on June 25, 1950 at 4 a.m. The division of Korea into two parts had occurred after World War II, when the U.S. and Russia agreed to occupy the northern and southern halves for administrative purposes. The 38th parallel separated the two. Free elections were held in 1948 in the American zone, with Syngman Rhee becoming president. The Russians established a Soviet-style government in the north, while the United States removed its armed forces from Korea in June 1949. On a Saturday evening in June, the State Department received an urgent telegram from the embassy in Korea. It stated, according to Korean Army reports, which are partly confirmed by Korean Military Advisory Group Field Advisor reports, North Korean forces invaded Republic of Korea territory at several points this morning. Action was initiated about 4 a.m. An amphibious landing was reportedly made south of Gangneung on the east coast. The UN Security Council, with a Russian delegate missing, labeled the North Koreans aggressors and ordered their immediate withdrawal to north of the 38th parallel. The North Koreans, however, pressed their attack. The Security Council called on all members of the UN to render every assistance to South Korea. Within days, American air, ground, and naval forces were on their way to South Korea. On July 7, 1950, the UN created a unified command under General Douglas MacArthur. The UN Army consisted of contingents of Americans and South Koreans, as well as units of 15 other nations. This was the first time in history an army was brought together by an international organization. In September 1950, MacArthur's UN forces went on the offensive and pushed the North Koreans back to the Yellow River, the border between Red China and Korea. In November 1950, Chinese Communist volunteers crossed into northern Korea, attacked UN forces, and drove the UN forces back below the 38th parallel. The UN armies dug in, eventually managing to advance to the 38th parallel, where they remained in a military stalemate until the end of the war. On April 11, 1951, President Truman, acting as Commander-in-Chief of the American forces, relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command. Chinese intervention had raised serious questions. The ouster was brought about because MacArthur had urged, 1, an all-out war to win complete victory over communism in Asia, 2, carry the war to Red China, and in addition, 3, he had criticized the administration's so-called appeasement. A final truce to the Korea War was signed at Panmunjom in July 1953, ending the fighting without a peace treaty. The armistice provided for the 1, continued division of North and South Korea at approximately the 38th parallel, 2, the exchange of prisoners of war. Although officially considered a police action, the Korean War was a costly one, 54,000 dead and 103,000 wounded. It also forced the United States to reassess its Asian policy. It was believed that a new phase of communist expansion and aggression had begun. President Truman had stated that the attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubts that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war. The United States demonstrated that it was willing to use its own forces to prevent communist inroads. It was further believed that war could be avoided by full military preparedness, especially the development of Allied conventional forces. To further prevent communist gains in Asia, the United States began to strengthen its military alliances, particularly with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, nationalist China, the Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, France, and the United Kingdom. While 19th century American policy was concerned with territorial integrity of Far Eastern nations, 20th century U.S. policy was broadened to include democratic institutions. In 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, appointed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, announced, "The way to deter aggression is for the free community to be willing and able to respond vigorously at places and with means of its own choosing." The strength of this policy was gradually tested in Vietnam. In October 1954, a letter from President Dwight D. Eisenhower to the Vietnamese Premier Ngo Dinh Diem pledged U.S. assistance in developing and maintaining a strong, viable state capable of resisting attempted subversion or aggression through military means. In the latter part of the 19th century, the French had gained control of the area which became known as French Indochina. After World War I, nationalist groups appeared to challenge French rule. The Japanese occupied this area during World War II. By the time the French returned, Moscow-trained Ho Chi Minh had taken over the leadership of the nationalist movement. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnamese independence. Recognizing the anti-colonial struggle, the returning French granted partial autonomy to the Vietnamese state. But civil war continued in Indochina from December 1946 to July 21st, 1954, when the French were defeated in their stronghold of Dien Bien Phu. The defeat occurred while the French were negotiating a settlement in Geneva, Switzerland. At Geneva, the French agreed to give up North Vietnam to the communist faction led by Ho Chi Minh. Elections to determine the fate of all of Vietnam was to be held in 1956. In addition, Vietnam was to be divided at the 17th parallel temporarily. This temporary division hardened into a permanent one when the elections provided for in the Geneva Accord failed to take place. Communist guerrillas, who had gone north when Vietnam was divided, returned to undertake military action against the South Vietnamese government. Not yet fully aware that it was sitting on a potential tinderbox, the United States sent a military advisory group to South Vietnam in 1955. This assistance was increased during the Kennedy administration to 685 men in 1960, 4,000 men in the beginning of 1962, and 10,000 by the end of 1962. At the end of 1965, the estimated total U.S. military force was just under 200,000, and by late 1968, there were approximately 540,000 United States fighting men in Vietnam. How did U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalate from an advisory capacity to that of a full-scale land war? In June 1971, a series of articles based on a secret Pentagon study of United States participation in the Vietnam War revealed how the covert warfare against North Vietnam had expanded into an all-out war. On August 2nd, 1964, United States destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Both houses of Congress authorized the President to take any measures he deemed necessary. President Johnson acted by ordering the air bombing of North Vietnamese cities. A scenario of contingency plans was activated. By July of 1965, just 11 months later, the President approved the deployment of 193,887 troops in Vietnam. Nevertheless, problems of the Vietnam War mounted. Guerrilla tactics, it seemed, was not conventional warfare. A rift developed when the reality of the war became apparent to the American public. While foreign aid was helpful in obtaining commitments which were intended to buttress the containment against communist expansion in Asia, dollar costs of the Vietnam commitments placed a serious strain on the American economy. Measured against the stark reality of the war to the Vietnamese people, Americans began to wonder how the United States had become involved in the war and how it could be ended. On March 31st, 1968, President Johnson appeared on TV to announce that he would not run for renomination. This decision was based on the hope that stepping down would encourage a peaceful settlement of the Vietnamese War. At the close of 1968, peace talks commenced in Paris with North Vietnam, Viet Cong, and United States, South Vietnam participation. Many months of unproductive discussions occurred with little progress toward actual peace. President Nixon's peace initiative, which included the further withdrawal of American troops, was announced on October 7, 1970. And U.S. Communist-Chinese relations made an abrupt about-face when a United States ping-pong team was invited into China, and President Nixon announced his trip to Peking. But the factors which influenced the future of Southeast Asia and China were so numerous that progress was very gradual towards the cooling of the hot war in Vietnam and the Cold War in China.